scary.
So welcome everyone. This is the Quant University Fall School guest lecture series. And today we are fortunate to have Dr. Valeria Sadovykh from PwC, Jun Wu from Forbes, and Dr. Reid Blackman from Virtue Consultants. And the theme of today is responsible AI in action. And in today's discussion, we're going to talk about the various aspects of what responsible AI and ethics means when we start adopting AI within the enterprise. My name is Sri Krishnamurthy, and in the last 16 to 18 weeks, we have been hosting these Wednesday lunch and learn sessions, lunch and learn for the folks who live in the East Coast at least. But we have had people from different parts of the world attend these sessions, and I just saw someone from Kuala Lumpur say hi in the chat window. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction to what we do at Quant University, and we will get the discussion flowing. So let me share my screen. I hope you can all see my screen. We are based out of Boston, and we started out in 2013, focusing on the intersection of data science, machine learning, and quantitative finance. We have done a lot of training programs, and before COVID-19, we were mostly going to various firms and ramping up their data science and machine learning workforces. And also, we run a model risk advisory, and as a third-party validator, we validate various kinds of models. And the Q Academy, which is our online learning platform, is powered by Q Sandbox, which is basically a platform which runs in the cloud to build out machine learning applications. And we have been doing these fall school lectures, and every quarter we pick a theme, and then the theme of this quarter is machine learning, scalable AI, model governance, and fintech post COVID-19. So we've been looking at various themes as we start operationalizing AI with the enterprise. What are the various challenges? What are the various opportunities and pitfalls? And how we can potentially bring in the practitioner-based approach to bring out some of the key challenges which are out there in the enterprise, and then make it available as through this forum for discussion so that we can educate ourselves, but also look for opportunities wherein we can curate and build better solutions. Now, in the fall, after the fall school comes the winter school. So please check out qwinterschool.splashtop.com. We have a number of different courses we are putting together, and we are partnered with Premier to offer some of them in an online mode. And we are also putting together some new courses, contextual in today's day and age with COVID-19. We are putting together some courses on explainable AI, and also in the aspect of stress testing, especially if you're building quant models and you're looking at the world and seeing that some of the models don't work. Without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to be discussing today. The theme of today is responsible AI in action. And a few weeks back, when we started thinking about the various aspects, and the reason why I was particularly interested in this topic is I'm a big follower of LinkedIn. I keep going into LinkedIn more than I should. And every day I see at least 5 to 10 different posts on different frameworks, different white papers, different approaches, different tools, talking about bias, ethics, responsible AI, and various themes coming from different perspectives. And one of the key pieces which I am when I'm curating all this information, is that many of these themes are kind of one-sided, because people come from different perspectives. But as practitioners, we have to understand that all these solutions which we have been building, and the recommendations, the papers which are coming out in various frameworks, are things which needs to be practical and pragmatic enough that it could be adopted within the enterprise. And that's kind of the topic of discussion today. And let's start with the discussion, and I'll take a minute and let our eminent speakers introduce themselves. Valeria, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. First of all, it is my pleasure to be here today and to share my academic and practical perspective on such an important topic such as AI ethics. And I think AI ethics now touch base everyone in the world, as an organization, individual, institutions, and corporations. So as for myself, I'm Valeria Sadovykh. I work for PwC Labs. At PwC Labs, we design, deploy, and implement innovative technology for corporate clients. We utilize Industry 4.4, machine learning, AI, mass customization, intelligent automation solutions. I have been in technology consulting for many years. I have been working across New Zealand and Australia, Southeast Asia, Europe, and now I'm based in the US. In addition to my consulting career, I'm also quite a big advocate of academia. I have a PhD from University of Auckland, New Zealand, and my research team is actually focusing on responsible AI, AI and ethics, how emerging technology is impacting human decision making, and what is our rate of adoption and accelerating of AI in our everyday usage. And with overall agenda, I'm kind of trying to look into how AI can actually have a social impact on our lives. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Valeria, and welcome. Jun, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Jun. I'm a contributor to Forbes. I used to be a technologist in the financial industry. I worked for various banks in Asia and in New York as well as a technologist. So from the practical side, I'm familiar with some of the operational aspects of responsible AI. And thank you, Shri, for inviting me today. Right now, as a contributor to Forbes, I talk to business leaders in both the startup community as well as in the fintech and financial community about some of the topics related to AI implementations. One of the big topics that I'm following right now is enterprise AI. And so it's really a pleasure to be taking part in this discussion today with the both of you and Shri. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jun, and welcome. Reid?
So I'm Reid Blackman. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Virtue. So Virtue is an ethical risk consultancy where we focus on helping senior leaders operationalize AI ethics programs. So I've been doing this for about 2.5 years. That's when I started the company. Prior to that, I was a philosophy professor. So teaching, researching, publishing on ethics for about 15 years now. That's me.
Oh, thank you so much and welcome. And so we can kind of, roll up our sleeves and get into a discussion more now. So we don't have to kind of keep this discussion formal. So feel free to chime in, and people who are listening in, feel free to use the chat window and also the Q&A window so that we can pose any questions you have. So first of all, let's kind of get to the most important question of the day. What is AI ethics? Anybody can start, and then we can kind of go around the room.
What is AI?
What is AI ethics?
Oh, AI ethics.
How do you define AI ethics?
I mean, look, in a way, it's not that complicated. Look, you don't need to articulate a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something as counting as an AI ethical issue. You can't do that for most things anyway. You can't do that for what constitutes a chair. Very hard to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for what constitutes a chair. Look, there are all these ethical issues. You don't want to discriminate against people unjustifiably. You don't want to violate people's privacy. You don't want to harm people in a way it's such that you don't know why you're doing it. You don't want to crash cars into people. You don't want blah, 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 right? There's lots of sort of things that we already understand as being ethical issues generally. And AI ethics is just a matter of, okay, we've got this new kind of tool. It works in various ways. Some of the ways that it works and some of the use cases make it the case that various ethical issues arise. AI ethics is then, it depends on where you're coming from, whether you're in business or you're, say, a regulator. But if you're in business, then what you're probably thinking about is how do we develop and deploy AI in a way that is ethically and thus reputationally safe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Valeria, do you have a similar viewpoint, or do you want to add something to that?
I do want to clarify something. Like, we talk so much about technology making mistakes and AI, making a bias, errors, and things like that. What I do want to that people understand that technology is an extension of our human beings, right?
Mhm.
So we are biased. What technology actually done at that current moment, they uncovered our own biases and our own faults. And we as a human beings now blaming technology for being biased, rather than we don't understand that it's actually us, still us making those faults and making those problems. So I do want to, sometimes we talk about the technology so much, but I think we need to step back and actually look at us as a human.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. We kind of think about technology first, but we had to think about humans first.
Yeah, humans. And I think we still are the one who making decision, and we are the one who design and deploy those technology, whether it is for personal use or organizational use. So the root cause probably have to go to the human being back.
Absolutely. And Jun, you've been talking to a lot of business professionals, technologists in your interviews, and you've also been doing research in this area for a lot of. I've seen many articles on this theme from you. How do you define AI ethics and responsible AI in general?
Okay. I mostly agree with Reid and his interpretation of ethical AI. However, for me, I feel like you, I'm inundated with research and papers related to responsible AI. And I think there needs to be a distinction between responsible AI and ethical AI.
Mm-hmm.
And that distinction is sort of very nuanced, I think, and perhaps it's very personal to each practitioner as well. And so I actually want to ask this question and what that distinction means to Reid and Valeria as well. But from my point of view, I feel that responsible AI is sort of thinking about ethical AI in everyday terms. Where you're on the ground when you're operationalizing AI, what are some of the practical questions that you're asking to make sure your AI implementation follows a set of frameworks that your firm might be adopting. And so responsible AI to me is perhaps a subset of ethical AI. And that is a little bit of a nuance. And I think maybe when I talk to practitioners, it feels to me like a lot of practitioners are thinking about responsible AI within the bigger framework of ethical AI, and then taking steps incrementally forward every day in their projects to think about questions related to responsible AI in order to move toward sort of the ultimate goal of ethical AI. And that to me is a very interesting nuance between the two terms.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the themes which I've been looking at is whenever I read a paper, and I'm completely with you, because everybody's definition is different of what ethical AI actually means. So if we just kind of step back a little bit and talk about what's driving this in certain ways, this AI ethics revolution. Why are so many people so passionately talking about it? Why are they writing so many papers? Why are so many tools and frameworks coming out? This is not something wherein you can monetize and basically say, well, this is a business driver and we are all going to be chiming in, right? But how do you see AI ethics so much in the forefront now, and everybody's talking about it? Like, what's the key driver or drivers, making all this happen?
I'll probably go back to my point, right, when I said that technology actually made it transparent for us to see all of the biases, human biases, and we realized how we are biased towards human race, towards age, education, zip code, how all of our decisions are being manipulated, whether they've been manipulated by the big organization, tech giants, social media. There is lots of noise on how we elect the presidential campaign, what are we buying, and so on. So I think that's why it's become a buzz, right? It's become a buzz that's become so transparent and uncovered. So people start focusing on this. And that's why organizations start also thinking about it, that, hey, how do we make it explainable to people that they do understand how AI technology make the decisions? And I think within an organization, and I can see that everyone is concerned, but the problem is they don't know how to go about it, what to do. And that's why we're here talking about the actions. What are actually the actions they need to take? We talk about explainable AI, right? But however, we're also quite concerned about opening up about our weaknesses, right? Weaknesses in our systems, weaknesses in our historical data. If we talk about the hiring system, right? We all know that most of the organizations got the historical data that the white man takes the leadership position, right? And the women are just not there. So who do we blame for this? Do we blame the history? Do we blame the man, or do we blame the technology? So I personally think that the definitions between responsible AI and ethics AI, it's probably a question of preference. However, I can see that doesn't matter what the term we're going to use, it's an extension to our existing operation of GRC framework, governance, risk management, and compliance, right? I think it should be linked to the existing government structure and government process that we have in process with additional layer on specifically biases, AI technology.
That's right. Reid, do you have a viewpoint? I know you've been consulting for various companies. What are the key drivers? Why do they call you in the first place? Why are there concerns they're having internally, or they're trying to educate themselves, or combination? Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, look, different people have different motives, right? And then there's also what they say their motives are, and then what their motives are, right? So, look, some people really care, right? They really take the ethics of it seriously. They care about fairness and anti-discrimination, yada, yada, yada. And so those people are motivated for those reasons. Some people say that those are their reasons, but really it's risk mitigation, right? It's not so much that they're passionate about the cause, they're just really passionate about not screwing things up and getting in trouble for it. And by the way, that's a fine motive as far as I'm concerned. I mean, when we're talking about ethical AI and practice in business, I don't think it's necessary that people be moved for the right reasons, as it were. Doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is better than what's going on right now, which is doing the wrong thing, period, right? So to my mind, doing the right thing for the wrong reasons is better than just doing the wrong thing. So some people are motivated by straightforward risk mitigation as opposed to a passion for justice or something like that. Some people are driven by ego, right? They want to be the leader in ethical AI. It's all the buzz now. And so wouldn't it be awesome if I were the person who was leading that charge in our company, in the industry, et cetera. So sometimes it's ego. So when it comes to why people in business are actually doing it, there's not a single reason, there's not a single motive. Not only is there not a single motive among individuals, there's not even a single motive within a given individual. A lot of, these different motives can be present inside of an individual. And they can be of varying strengths, varying by person. And the same thing goes with the question about why is it such a hot topic now? Why is everybody talking about it? Well, there's lots of stuff. Some are, swept up justifiably or unjustifiably so in certain social movements, say Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and they want to find expression. They want to express that commitment in the work that they happen to be in. So if you're passionate about, say, the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, and you happen to be in tech, well, here's a nice place to start talking about it in AI ethics, as opposed to whether if you're somebody in HR, right? So there's a way in which what's going on in society gets brought in to the tech world simply because people who are in society and have tech jobs want to express their passions in the particular roles that they're in.
That's very interesting.
And then the very last thing I'll say in regards to Jun's question about responsible versus ethical AI, look, in some ways, this is just a semantic issue, right? How do we want to stipulate use of these terms? I think that one way that it goes on is that people use the term responsible AI because they don't know what the heck AI ethics is. But if you talk about responsibility, that sort of makes more sense to you than ethics, which strikes people as particularly nebulous. Other times people use responsible AI as a grab bag where in contrast to what Jun pointed out, they see AI ethics as a subset of responsible AI because they throw into responsible AI things like robustness and accuracy and cyber attack ready and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which responsible AI becomes a grab bag for doing AI in a way that's not messed up for whatever category of messed up you like.
Absolutely. And Jun, in your discussions with various people in your research, do you kind of see that the technologists who are working towards solutions are seeing it as a business opportunity, or is it they're kind of building out the risk mitigation solutions, or seeing this as an opportunity for various companies to tap into to address some of the concerns which Reid and Valeria talked about?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because what I have seen is two kinds of companies. I think the kind of companies who are camels, who are really into building things for the long haul, right? Those are the companies that in my initial discussions with companies, responsible AI naturally comes out of the discussions, and it doesn't come out from the profit point of view, or it comes out from the value point of view. When they're talking about the value of their company, the culture that they have established in their company, responsible AI is sort of comes out of that discussion. And I feel like the culture of the company perhaps sets the tone for responsible AI, and that to me sort of speaks to this camel kind of company. Another type of companies that I talk to are on the cutting edge of emerging technology. They're in experimentation stage. They're trying to sort of operationalize a type of technology that just came right out of research, very fresh, early stage startups, and they are not in the mind frame of thinking about responsible AI yet. However, they know that they have to at some point, so it is a very, they are in the process of getting their company capitalized, right, fully, so that responsible AI perhaps comes out of the discussion with venture capitalists and funding, and all of that, those discussions, but they're not in a place where they are thinking about what would responsible AI mean operationally in their business plan, and how do they build it into their technology yet. So there are two kinds of companies, and I think in the financial industry, perhaps you see the contrast between fintech early stage startup versus corporate large investment banks. The contrast between how they are handling responsible AI. Yeah, perhaps that's a really good comparison.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things which we haven't talked about is the place we are in terms of the technology cycle, right? So we are seeing a tectonic shift in the way in which AI is influencing our lives, which we hadn't seen 10 years ago. We didn't have those access. We would see the cool videos and we would say, oh, this is pretty cool. It's Boston Dynamics is building all these amazing robots. But we are seeing these technologies kind of integrate into our lives. Things like facial recognition, use of different kinds of methodologies in which the way we take decisions, like applying for a credit card. Who's making a decision? We don't know if it's an algorithm or a human sitting and making a decision. Or things like autonomous driving, wherein we are going to be delegating the responsibility of driving to machines, and now we have to coexist with another device which is making decisions versus we making decisions as humans. So in some aspects, there's this paranoia/fear, oh, we are adopting something new. And one of the things we want to talk about is how does this fit in the context of responsible AI, ethical AI? On the other hand, we also have to talk about this notion of accountability, right? So who's going to be responsible, no pun intended, to implement responsible AI within the enterprise, right? Because we have the ethics board. I come from financial services perspective, and financial industry has been pioneering this whole notion of risk management and model risk management in particular for many, many decades. And we have a specific department. People are actually hired to put the gating process to make sure that the models which are going out into production have gone through the vetting process. And also there is gating in terms of fiduciary responsibilities. So there are at least some structure. And obviously there's regulatory aspects wherein there is regulations on what you can and cannot do. But in the way AI is coming and the way innovations are coming, it's a little bit of a wild west. How do you see the organization structure And how do you see who's going to be responsible in making sure that some of these principles we are talking about are actually enforceable and pragmatic within the enterprise? And I just want to leave with one quote with Andrew Ng in one of his newsletter had mentioned, which had there was a white paper put out by a large organization about AI ethics. And he apparently talked to one of the engineers who was actually implementing some of this. And the quote was, well, it's nice that they're thinking about it, but from my day-to-day perspective on the way I do my job, and it's not going to change much. I'm going to be doing what I'm going to be doing, right? So how do we make sure that we have the right kinds of accountability structure within the enterprise? Reid, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure. So look, one of the issues that we're seeing for why AI ethics is having difficulty getting uptake, aside from the fact that people don't understand what the term ethics means and they don't know how to think about it and they don't know how to operationalize it, is that there is no cross-organizational standard about who ought to own this problem. Mm-hmm. There's just none. There's something forming, some convergence of views about this, but there's no standard. And when we know that when there's no cross-organizational standard, that means you need someone in a leadership position to stand up and say, I'll own it, which also means they need to spend budget on it. But if you don't have any cross-organizational standard, and people don't want to spend their budget on stuff, then they're not going to spend it on this, right? So one thing is there needs to be some kind of cross-organizational standard about who owns it. Now, as for who that ought to be, first of all, it's got to be in the C-suite, someone in the C-suite. These sort of robust AI ethical risk program is not going to be maintained and sustained and scaled if it doesn't have buy-in from senior leadership, because it's going to have to be woven into every facet of the organization, right? It's going to be in product development, it's going to be in marketing, it's going to be in operations, it's going to be everywhere. And it also, people have to receive the right kinds of financial incentives in the absence of financial disincentives. So the engineer that you were talking about in his or her day-to-day, if they're not evaluated on the extent to which they weave in the requirements of the ethical risk program into their operations, then that person's right, they're not going to do it. And so you need a push from senior leadership to make that happen. Now, then the question is who within the C-suite is the appropriate person? And it looks like the most appropriate person, and I'm seeing the most adoption, the most leadership around these roles is something like a chief data officer or chief analytics officer or chief data and analytics officer, somebody with a title like that. It also incidentally needs board oversight. The board needs to be aware of these massive reputational risks. So it should be someone in the C-suite. It looks like it should be something like a chief data officer, chief analytics officer, because at the end of the day, they're overseeing all the engineers who are making these products, and they need the support of not only the rest of the C-suite, but the board as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jun, do you have a point of view?
Yeah, I actually, I agree that someone in the C-suite should probably own this. However, I do think of ethical AI as a cross-functional sort of, I think about ethical AI in terms of enterprise AI initiatives, so because I feel like so many corporations are moving to enterprise level AI now, where models, data, and all of that are enterprise grade or enterprise assets, so to speak, right? And so because of that, the responsibility sort of is almost exponentially higher to make sure everything works properly, right? And so because there's no standards, like Reid said, that it gets very, very difficult to actually sort of manage have accountability in managing all of these enterprise assets, so how are the business units are going to be divided in that case? So mm-hmm. I feel like what you need is not necessarily a reorg or anything. What you need is perhaps a committee where a cross-functional committee where heads, chief data officers, chief model risk officer, chief, everyone sort of gets together in a committee in which they collectively own this ethical AI issue. And especially with compliance, being such a huge part of all of this equation, sort of law and compliance, that department, should always also have a voice in this particular committee, where it would be headed up by someone in the C-suite. I think that, practically speaking, might work better. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert. So yeah, I'm just putting this idea out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Valeria, when you are brought in as a consultant, how do you advise, because everybody is talking at different levels, and one of the challenges, and I also consult with various companies, and one of the challenges I had was, from an engineer's perspective, say, I already have so many things to do. I can't think about things which I'm not told I should be doing. So tell me what I should be doing and I'll factor that in. But when it comes down to the C-suite, they are talking in generality, in principle. So how do we kind of bring in this accountability, what do you call waterfall, through the enterprise?
Yeah, and I have 2 points to it, but the first one, to answer your question, right? One thing I do want to bring, we do have designers and developers and the users, right? And they are subject matter experts. It's good to have the board, it's good to have a process in place, but we also need to focus on executors, right? Mm-hmm. And one thing that comes into place, you said to me, the engineers, they don't have time on and etc. Well, actually, have they been educated enough on the ethical principles? Do they understand the design ethical principles in case of how the technology should be responsible, how it should be accessible, who is it designed for, what are the use cases, what are the fairness, what is the purpose of the design technology, right? So I think those questions are the one that we need to put forward in front of our developers and designers, first of all, before we can further roll out any of the tools, because they're the one who's got the knowledge, right? They're the one who's going to distribute it. And subject, for example, chief data officer might not necessarily even know the purpose of the technology that is used in the organization. And that's actually quite scary. So until we educate as our users in our initial point of view with technology, we cannot progress further, right? Until we will plug it in the mind of our developers, that's you need to look at those KPIs, right, in any tool until you actually can further roll it out to the audience. I think that's the first aspect for me, and I always kind of try to bring it up as long as we need to keep the conversation free, right? We need to keep it going. We need to question it. How responsive is the technology we design? Who is it designed for? Who is going to use it? What are the use cases? Have we thought about the use cases that might potentially harm our users? Or we're only thinking about the best possible outcome? That's the first question. And then after that, I do want to ask the question in terms of to our audience as well as the other two participants is, there's all of this ethical design and the rules. Are we making it compulsory, or we want a genuine governance on responsibility of AI? How do we track it now? If it becomes the same as the quality, how we've got the quality compliance rules, or is it ethics, and the ethical is something personal and it's up to you how you're going to navigate it? So I think that's also becoming quite an interesting question with organizations and the people.
Absolutely. Now, just to look, give just a little bit of a switch in terms of topics, and I want to kind of focus more on the AI part of the ethics, AI ethics thing, right? So AI has significantly changed in the last 10 years. The complexity of algorithms, the meta learning, automatic machine learning, the use of GPUs, the different kinds of models which are out there. Frankly, though I teach at the graduate school machine learning and related topics, just to keep track of what's happening and to really understand how these algorithms work, it's becoming a challenge. And when I talk to companies, that's one of the challenges they talk about, saying, well, we don't have that level of smart people to actually understand and build out. And many a times we just go for automatic machine learning solutions or APIs, and we don't know how the technologies are built, and we don't have the choice to go in and hire someone like who's with a PhD and can actually code up these algorithms from scratch. And secondly, it's not even feasible and practical to build out that kind of technology workforce within every organization wanting to use AI and machine learning, right? So the challenge becomes, how much of it should be something we assume that someone has done the due diligence and we adopt it, versus we building the structures to do the due diligence ourselves. And the secondary aspect to this whole dilemma is, most of these models in AI and machine learning today are data-driven. And unfortunately, when we look at historical data, we don't have clean, ethically followed principles, in our data sets. The way decisions have happened in the past, these are biased data sets. Now, the decisions were done by humans. Humans have inherent biases, and those are reflected in the decisions which were made. And now we are thinking about building machinery to operationalize these decisions. And these machines and algorithms are learning from past behaviors. And then explicit intervention needs to happen to make sure that you are not kind of baking in these inherent biases which were observed into newer algorithms, and we standardize these biases which we have observed in the past, right? Now, what are we aiming at in here? Are we aiming at creating ideal machines which are going to mimic the state of the world we all aspire to be in, which may not be something we can sell, to be very honest, because enterprises will think that, well, I won't be able to make decisions. It's going to hit my bottom line, so I won't be able to adopt it. Versus achieving human level intelligence, wherein we say, well, humans make these kinds of decisions, humans make mistakes, and machines are doing things on par with how humans would make mistakes. So if we assume that that's the level of performance we can get, it's acceptable. So where do we stand in this debate? Should we aim for the ideal, saying, all or none, it has to be at this particular standard, otherwise we won't be able to adopt it, versus let's aim at what humans potentially can do, which is reflected in what we have seen in the past, and try and bake those into machines. Jun, you want to start?
Well, that's a really big question, and that's a question that I grapple with every day as I talk to business leaders and technologists. And I think many people are thinking about this. However, I feel like responsible AI and ethical AI, the central theme here is not just taking accountability, but also rigor, right? And rigor is something that we're all very, very familiar in investment banking, right? And it all started with a simple model someone built, right, a long, long time ago, that was statistical, that was, and there were tests that were run, and it all started with this very, very small thing, and that wasn't very well tested. And then later on, people sort of added on to it, the components were added on, and complicated, more and more complex models were created, right? And therefore, more and more complex tests and all of that were devised, and the pipelines were built, and all of that. So what I think is rigor, right, is a mindset, right, that everyone who works in the financial industry is very, very familiar with. And now is probably the optimal time when you're talking about enterprise-wide AI and upgrading AI algorithms and thinking about the complexity of testing versus the complexity of implementation and the complexity of algorithms, all of these trade-offs, right? Explainability and all of these ethical issues. When you sort of take this rigorous mindset into working with these problems, I think any incremental difference that you can make in raising difficult issues and difficult questions to highlight trade-offs, right? Highlight accountability where they need to be made is probably the most important. So rather than looking at ideals, standards, metrics, this and that, at the individual level, if you're a technologist, risk manager, business unit manager, if you just take this rigorous mindset into every single decision that you're making throughout this enterprise-wide project, and raising issues as you see them, when you're coming across difficult ethical issues and ethical dilemmas and all of that, I think you eventually you get to a place that's pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it could be better than today. That's what I thought, because I really think thinking about the ideal standard and sort of the optimal solution might actually make people sort of be a little bit more afraid to take that first step, or even incremental steps. That's
absolutely. So Reid, I loved your article, Practical Guide to Building Ethical AI in HBR. You seem to have the recipe. What do you think should be the way in which we should address this problem or dilemma?
Sorry, so say that last thing again.
What do you think on how do we address this dilemma of building human level intelligence versus, leveraging historical biases? And
I mean, so look, at least in business, the name of the game is bias mitigation, is risk mitigation, right? That's what this is about. People will talk about, some people talk about ethics or AI ethics, they're talking about AI for good, what's all the good things that we can do in the world. And that's really important, but it's not what most businesses have in mind when they're building their products, right? So there's the AI for good people, and then there's the AI for not bad people. And I am squarely in the AI for not bad camp, which is to say, let's use AI for ethically good and ethically neutral ends. And in our pursuit of those ethically good or ethically neutral ends or goals, let's not ethically screw up, right? So that's one thing to say. It's also the only kind of thing that's generally going to motivate people to spend budget. If that's a for-profit company that's going to motivate them to spend budget on it, is that it's risk mitigation, unless they have some CSR function or something along those lines. Another thing to say is that we are not very good about articulating the ideal, what constitutes the ideal. There's a long history of ethicists and political theorists contemplating or arguing about the ideals. And it's very difficult to discern what exactly the ideal situation is. On the other hand, we're much better at figuring out what's really bad for us. So that's really where the focus ought to be, I think. What are the ways we can really do harm, wrong people, breach obligations, breach people's rights, and how do we ensure, to the best of our ability, that we're not doing those things? That's the first and foremost goal. Actually, that's the goal, even if you do have noble ends. First, do no harm.
Absolutely. Valeria, what do you think?
So coming back to your original question, right? Should we hold machines to higher standards, or should we aim for better human intelligence at one extent? I think I still will go back to probably my first point. It's up to us, it's humans, right? We need to, again, educate ourselves. We as a humans, we evolve, right? So we need to accept the technology with its biases, and we also need to know what are the biases is in order to make a better decision as for organizations and people. So I would probably go in the answer that we need to evaluate ourselves, and we need to grow our own intelligence in order to progress further. And again, not to do harm, and understand what harm means to each of us, to different groups, to different race, and to different age as well. So, and also look at the design principles of the technology again, and understand the use cases.
Absolutely.
Can I just say one more thing on this?
Yes.
So look, there's a way of thinking about ethics and doing ethics, engaging in ethical inquiry that ethicists are very familiar with. And you'll ask questions like the following: what constitutes human flourishing? What constitutes a just society? These are really big questions. Been talking about it for literally thousands of years. They're very complex. We're not going to get anything like that by engineers, right? We're not going to get flourishing by design. That's not happening. So don't talk about I don't see the point in talking about things like what constitutes human flow. I mean, in a business context, we are talking about, all right, look, we need the data collectors to have role-specific responsibilities for either realizing our values or helping us to avoid our ethical and reputational nightmares. The engineers, the product developers, they need role-specific responsibilities. The product managers, to Valeria's earlier point, they need sufficient education such that they can smell ethical smoke and they can pull in a lever. To Jun's point, so that it goes to the proper deliberative body so that they can determine what the proper risk mitigation strategies ought to be, whether it means halting production altogether, canceling it, whether it means altering the product in this or that way, whether it means not distributing it in this place, but yes to distribute it in this other place. So there's, so this is my way of saying you're not going to get flourishing or just society by design. And you wouldn't want that anyway, because then all the onus will be on engineers and product managers to determine what constitutes human flourishing and a just society. But that's insane, right? Whatever, right. They're very smart people, and they don't have the training for it. And even if they did have the training for it, you also don't want a bunch of philosopher kings, right? So we don't want flourishing by design. We want, not human misery by design. That would be that would be enough. That would be a huge leap from where we are now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I think you touched upon when you were talking about this whole notion of risk mitigation. And I'm kind of looking at it from an engineer. I'm trained as an engineer. I mostly work with software tools, and I kind of work with people who are data scientists and machine learning professionals. And many a times when we think about how do we optimize things, right? So you put together an utility function, and then you think about optimization subject to constraints, right? So that's kind of the engineering way of thinking about various things. And risk mitigation always comes into play at that particular point. And now, the way I'm seeing some of these tools being positioned, especially whenever you talk about AI ethics, explainability comes in, interpretability, explainability, comes in. And the question is, well, if we know how things work, we'll be in a better position to accept things, right? One of the dilemma right now is black boxes are not transparent enough. And so we are not really sure whether they are making the right decisions. And many times, it's not just the concern that they are making biased decisions, it's the concern that I don't know how things are happening. And I'm assuming that the reason why it's hidden is because they don't want us to know what's happening, right? And that's where all these explainability tools are coming in, both the black box explainability, white box explainability, counterfactual, blah, blah, blah. There are so many frameworks. In fact, the whole reason why we are talking about explainability with so much vigor and all the investments going into these tooling is because we've kind of jumped the gun a bit and operationalized AI. And now we are thinking like, well, people are asking questions now. If a credit decision is made and now we are asked why that particular decision was made, now we have to go and explain why that decision was particularly made. And we need to go and be able to justify those decisions. So there's a risk mitigation aspect there. It's also the question of how much do we need to know? Who do we need to explain to, right? Is it okay to explain to ourselves? Is it okay to just explain to the developers? Are the developers being able to explain to others? Or the model risk managers saying, this is why these kinds of decisions are being made? Should we think about explaining it into the end users? And now the question becomes like, how much talent do all the people need to have? Because everyone needs to understand the metrics on how it was validated in the first place. And the whole notion of algorithmic auditing comes in. Who's going to be taking a look at it and figuring out whether this actually works as it was originally designed? Now, the question is, we have to make this practical and pragmatic, and we should reveal things about the algorithms without revealing the IP in various places. There are all these aspects. And when you think about risk mitigation, how do we address this challenge? Is it okay to say, well, we have AI, we have our governance bodies, we also have a tool which explains certain aspects of the solution, may not explain everything, but we have factored in, right? So we basically kind of taken a checklist approach saying we have done this, 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 and this, so we are okay with respect to this. Is that a good way of thinking about it, or should we be doing more? And are we still just scratching the surface of this whole AI ethics dilemma, and we need to kind of come together to a more pragmatic and approachable solution as we adopt AI into the enterprise. And we're still seeing only very few of these companies operationalizing AI, even though everybody's talking about it. Very few are actually operationalizing it because of all the concerns we are discussing now. So maybe Valeria, you want to start? I think we'll probably take this as the last question, and I think there are a couple of questions from the audience we'll take. Yeah.
Okay, I will try to be brief, and I will go to your point on algorithm auditors, right, and algorithm auditing. And being myself from an auditing firm, of course, obviously, I'm going to say it does make sense to have an audit and provide some sort of like review of the algorithm as well. However, the dilemma comes is who is going to have this knowledge on ethics and fairness and how they're going to audit the processes. The concept of the audit, like we audit the financial systems, we audit the tax systems, we audit the different processes, and it does make sense. With the ethics, it's going to be all new. So we will be going on the journey together, and we will be making mistakes, right? And we have to learn about these mistakes. And probably the things that our organization needs to do is to actually be transparent about those mistakes and those roadblocks and have the conversation open. So yeah, explainable AI is about being open and having a conversation and having diversity and being able to test and fail and again retest the system. So I'm an advocate for this, but however, it might be an expensive cost for all of us.
So Reid, you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's a ton to say here, and we don't have nearly enough time to say it all. Look, one question to ask is, why is explainability ethically important? Mm-hmm. It's not obvious to me that it always is, right? So let's say you've got a cancer diagnosing machine that's 99.9% accurate, but we don't have a clue how it gets to be so accurate. But it's been right in the last, 10,000 opportunities we gave it to make predictions. Do we say, no, don't use that anymore, even though you're saving tons of lives because it's not explainable? Dial down the accuracy for the sake of explainability? That's not obvious. I'm not saying that we ought to or ought not to. I'm at least saying that's an ethical question. And it's not obvious that the answer must always be, make sure it's explainable. That's one thing to say. So, which means that the question then is, when explainability is ethically relevant and ethically important, why is it? Is it intrinsically ethically important, or is it just important because it's a useful tool for some other stuff? So for instance, a lot of people think explainability is important because it's a useful way by which we can detect bias, which means it's instrumentally valuable, it's of use, but that doesn't mean that it's, if you like, intrinsically ethically important. On the other hand, sometimes it is really intrinsically ethically important, like if you're giving a risk rating for a defendant, and you determine whether they're going to be, whether they deserve probation if they're found guilty, et cetera, then you might think, well, we're harming someone so that we owe them an explanation. We owe them an explanation out of respect for their personhood or their rational agency or their moral worth or something along those lines. So again, there's lots to say here about why explainability is important when it is, and what makes it, what makes it ethically important. Man, maybe I have more to say, but we're running out of time. So let me pass it off to somebody else.
Jun, do you have any last thoughts?
Okay, I agree with Reid and Valeria, and particularly I agree with Valeria's iterative approach to thinking about this issue. And I do think that explainability is also not applicable in every single case, like Reid said. However, I want to add, however, explainability, sorry, it just escaped my mind. I was thinking about it when Reid was talking. I
can blather on again if you like, and look.
Because what you said kind of inspired this, but I think, you know what, given the time of this, I will probably just send a response to you later, Shri. Yeah, I'm sorry that it just escaped my mind.
But it was a good point that it's not always explainable. Yeah, I think it was really, like, Reid, you put it in the point. Sometimes we don't have to explain the decision, or it might be not the right environment to explain the decision. So how do we do about it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry, it just came back. So the point I wanted to add was monitoring. So this is why it's critically important, I think, for people to when you're embarked on enterprise-wide AI projects, when you're thinking about setting up the ways in which you can test and monitor the models, that you really critically monitor them for not just the scenarios that you have defined, but also monitor your models, how it's running in production, when it comes to abnormalities and things that you have not defined, and so that you can catch those circumstances in which you have not thought about how it might run. So take the experimentation mindset when you're monitoring what is in production, and kind of know that you don't know exactly everything about how the model will run in production once you have put into place. I think when you have that mindset, it might help you to kind of iteratively understand and be able to explain your models a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think, these are, each one of these themes, explainability, monitoring, they probably require its own session. And to continue the note, next week, we are going to have Dr. Agus Sugianto, who heads model risk at Wells Fargo. And his team has been building frameworks for explainable AI, and they've built out a package. So they're going to be talking about, what does it mean for interpretability and explainability from a financial services perspective, especially when they're dealing with large models. So with that note, I think we are on at 1 o'clock. So I thank you very much for spending your lunch break with us and talking about AI ethics and responsible AI in action. I think a lot of questions, a lot of themes were discussed, but obviously this is an evolving and an open topic. And we have multiple perspectives, and it has to be something which we have to discuss in the open before we can start crystallizing solutions which are pragmatic enough to be adopted with the enterprise. And one of the things I'm kind of trying to see is how can we as practitioners be vocal about the challenges we face when we are operationalizing some of these key themes within the enterprise, or even discuss some of the things we would like to have in terms of tooling, in terms of frameworks, in terms of concerns. That way, when we build solutions, they are, at least we have thought about the right kinds of constructs. We may not have all the solutions, but that's where the mitigations and controls comes in, right? In certain ways, we can potentially put in the controls within technologies. In certain ways, we can mitigate on certain ways, and we can put in gating processes and make humans responsible for the decisions. Ultimately, it's the humans making the decisions, leveraging machines rather than the other way around. We're not just delegating all our decisions to machines and letting the machines take responsibilities for those actions. We're still being responsible for those actions. With that note, I would like to thank you again for this amazing discussion. We will continue the discussion online, and hopefully we'll consolidate some of the thoughts we've been having and put something together as a white paper or blog or something like that. But I really appreciate you spending the time. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.